When Bruce Lee walked into the Golden Dragon restaurant that evening, he wasn't looking for a meal. He was looking for peace. But what he found was a family tearing itself apart in two languages, caught between two cultures, and running out of time. Wong had given his son everything: education, opportunity, freedom. But the one thing David wanted, his father couldn't give: understanding. And the one thing Mr. Wong needed, his son wouldn't give: respect for where they came from. In 72 hours, the restaurant sale would be final. Father and son would go their separate ways, and a 40-year dream of bridging East and West would die, not because it was impossible, but because nobody knew how. But Bruce Lee knew, because he was that bridge. And what he taught them that night wasn't just about saving a restaurant. It was about saving every family, caught between honoring their roots and reaching for their wings. What did Bruce Lee say that made a stubborn father and a frustrated son both cry? And how did one evening change not just 2 lives, but 200? It was a Thursday evening in October 1971, and the Golden Dragon restaurant in Los Angeles' Chinatown was about to close for the night. The last customers had paid their bills and left, but inside the kitchen, a war was brewing that had been building for 28 years. Mr. Wong stood near the wok station, his hands trembling with anger and heartbreak. He was 65 years old, and every wrinkle on his face told a story of sacrifice. He had come to America from Hong Kong in 1931, with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. For 40 years he had built this restaurant with his bare hands, learning English one word at a time, facing discrimination with quiet dignity, and creating a place where Chinese culture could thrive in a new land. His son David stood on the other side of the kitchen, a contract in his hand and frustration in his eyes. 28 years old, UCLA graduate, fluent in English but struggling with Cantonese, he represented everything his father had worked for, and everything his father feared losing. The argument had started simple enough. David wanted to modernize the restaurant, maybe change the menu, attract a younger crowd. But it had quickly escalated into something much deeper. It wasn't about the restaurant anymore. It was about identity. Mr. Wong was shouting in Cantonese, his voice cracking with emotion. David was responding in English, his words sharp and cutting, and between them lay a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. 2 languages, 2 worldviews, 2 definitions of success. What neither of them knew was that Bruce Lee was sitting in the dining room, sipping tea and listening to every word. He had come to the Golden Dragon that evening specifically seeking the quiet atmosphere after his training session. But the moment he heard the conflict in the kitchen, something stirred in him. He recognized this fight. He had lived it. In the kitchen, David was making his final argument. "Dad, you don't understand. I'm not Chinese, I'm not fully American either. I'm stuck in between, and this restaurant, it's a reminder of everything I can't be." Mr. Wong's face went pale. In all their years of fighting, David had never said anything so painful. You ashamed of who you are," he whispered in broken English. "I'm not ashamed, Dad. I'm just tired. Tired of trying to fit into a world that was yours, not mine. I got the buyer ready. We can sign the papers in 72 hours. You can retire, I can move on, and we can both finally be free." Mr. Wong turned away, his shoulders shaking. For 40 years he had poured his soul into this place. Every recipe was a connection to his father, who had taught him in Hong Kong. Every table held memories of customers who had become friends. Every dish was a bridge between the culture he loved and the country he had chosen. And now his son wanted to erase it all. The restaurant sale wasn't just about money or business. It was about erasing his legacy. It was about admitting that everything he had tried to build, everything he had tried to teach his son about heritage and identity, had failed. David set the contract down on the counter. "I'll leave this here. The buyer wants an answer by Sunday. That's 72 hours, Dad. Think about it. We both know this is the right thing to do." As David turned to leave through the back door, Mr. Wong spoke quietly in Cantonese, not expecting his son to understand. I failed you. I couldn't teach you to love where you come from. But David did understand. He had understood Cantonese all along, even though he rarely spoke it. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, but he didn't turn around. And then he left, the door closing with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Mr. Wong stood alone in his kitchen, surrounded by 40 years of memories, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely defeated. He had survived poverty, discrimination, and the hardship of starting over in a new country. But he couldn't survive losing his son's respect for their shared heritage. That's when Bruce Lee walked into the kitchen. He moved quietly, respectfully, his presence calm but undeniable. Mr. Wong looked up, startled, and immediately recognized him. Everyone in Chinatown knew Bruce Lee. He was the pride of the Chinese community, a man who had become successful in Hollywood without abandoning who he was. Mr. Wong, Bruce Lee said softly in Cantonese, I apologize for intruding, but I heard your conversation, and I felt I needed to speak with you. Mr. Wong wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed. Mr. Lee, sorry you hear that. Family business, very shameful. Bruce Lee shook his head. There's no shame in love, Mr. Wong. And what I heard wasn't a father and son who don't love each other. I heard two people who love each other so much that they're terrified of losing one another. Mr. Wong looked at Bruce Lee with surprise. You understand. More than you know, Bruce Lee replied, switching to English so the story would be clear. May I sit? I'd like to share something with you. Mr. Wong nodded, and they sat at one of the kitchen prep tables. Bruce Lee was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he began to speak, and his words would change everything. When I was young, Bruce Lee said, my father sent me from Hong Kong to America. I was 18 years old. I left everything I knew, everyone I loved, and came to a country where I didn't speak the language well, and where people looked at me like I was an enemy. Mr. Wong nodded. He knew that feeling too well. My father told me something before I left. Bruce Lee continued. He said, you must have roots deep enough to weather any storm, and wings strong enough to fly above any obstacle. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought roots and wings were opposites. How could you be grounded and fly at the same time? Bruce Lee paused, his eyes distant with memory. For years I struggled with the same conflict I heard between you and David. I felt Chinese people saw me as too American. American people saw me as too Chinese. I was fighting everyone, but really, I was fighting myself. Mr. Wong leaned forward, completely absorbed. This was Bruce Lee, one of the most successful Chinese Americans in the country, admitting he had felt the same pain. Then I realized something that changed my entire philosophy. Bruce Lee said, roots don't trap you, they strengthen you. And wings don't make you forget where you came from. They carry the essence of your roots to new heights. He looked directly at Mr. Wong. Your son doesn't want to erase your legacy, Mr. Wong. He wants to build on it. But he's terrified that if he changes anything, you'll think he's rejecting you. Mr. Wong's eyes widened. But he say he not Chinese. He said he's not just Chinese and not just American. Bruce Lee corrected gently. He's both. He's the bridge you built, Mr. Wong. You did exactly what you set out to do. You created a son who can walk in both worlds. But now you have to let him walk in his own way. The words hit Mr. Wong like a physical blow. All this time, he thought David was rejecting their culture. But maybe David was just trying to find his own version of it. Bruce Lee stood up. Mr. Wong, may I ask where your son went? He go to apartment. Few blocks away. Would you allow me to speak with him? And then perhaps the three of us could talk together. Mr. Wong hesitated, then nodded slowly. You try. I don't know if he listen. Bruce Lee smiled. Water flows around rocks, Mr. Wong. It doesn't fight them. It finds a way through. Your son has more of you in him than you realize. I just need to help him see it. 20 minutes later, Bruce Lee knocked on David's apartment door. When David opened it and saw who was standing there, his mouth literally dropped open. "Bruce Lee," David said, completely confused. "What are you? How did you?" "Your father told me where to find you," Bruce Lee said simply. "May I come in? I promise I won't take much of your time." David stepped aside, still in shock, and Bruce Lee entered the small but tidy apartment. He noticed immediately the photographs on the wall, several of them showing a younger David with his father at the restaurant, both smiling. He also noticed a Chinese calligraphy set on the desk, evidence that David hadn't completely abandoned his cultural connections. "David," Bruce Lee began, "I'm going to be very direct with you because time is precious, and you're planning to make a decision in 72 hours that you'll regret for the rest of your life." David's defenses went up immediately. "With all respect, Mr. Lee, you don't know my situation." "I know it exactly," Bruce Lee interrupted firmly. "Because I lived it, I am living it. Every single day." That stopped David cold. Bruce Lee continued, his voice intense but not unkind. "You think your father wants you to be a carbon copy of him. You think honoring your heritage means imprisoning yourself in the past. You think you have to choose between being Chinese and being American. And you're wrong on all three counts." David sat down slowly, his anger deflating into confusion. Then what does he want from me?" "He wants to know that everything he sacrificed mattered," Bruce Lee said. "He came to this country with nothing, David. He faced hatred, discrimination, and loneliness. He worked 18-hour days for 40 years. And he did it all so you could have choices he never had." "I know that," David said, frustration creeping back into his voice. "That's why I feel so guilty. I can't be what he wants me to be. I can't run a traditional Chinese restaurant and pretend I'm something I'm not." "He doesn't want you to pretend," Bruce Lee said. "He wants you to transform it. But you're so busy running away that you can't see the incredible opportunity in front of you." David looked up, confused. "What opportunity?" Bruce Lee leaned forward. "David, you speak both languages. You understand both cultures. You can take everything your father built and make it speak to a new generation. You can honor the roots while spreading the wings. But instead you're choosing to burn it all down because you're afraid." "Afraid?" David said defensively. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if you embrace your Chinese heritage, you'll never be fully accepted as American. Afraid that if you change your father's restaurant, he'll stop loving you. Afraid that you're stuck between two worlds with no place to belong." The words hit David like arrows, each one striking true. His eyes started to water. Bruce Lee's voice softened. "Let me tell you what I learned, David. You're not stuck between two worlds. You are two worlds. That's not a weakness. That's your superpower. You can create something your father never could because he only lived in one world, and you can create something your American peers never could because they don't have your roots." "But the restaurant," David started. "The restaurant is a canvas," Bruce Lee said. "Your father painted the first layer, the foundation. Beautiful, strong, authentic. Now it's your turn to add the next layer. Not to erase his work but to build on it. To show the world that Chinese culture isn't a museum piece. It's a living, evolving thing." David was quiet for a long moment. "He'll never accept changes. He's too traditional." "He's not traditional. He's scared," Bruce Lee said. "Just like you. He's afraid that if anything changes, he'll lose you. And you're afraid that if you stay, you'll lose yourself. But what if I told you that both of you are wrong?" Bruce Lee stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Chinatown's lights. "Here's what I know about martial arts, David. The strongest style is the one that can adapt. The bamboo survives the storm not because it's rigid, but because it bends. Your father's restaurant has strong roots. Now it needs wings. And you are those wings." He turned back to David. "In 72 hours you can sign that contract and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Or you can come with me right now, talk to your father, and create something extraordinary together." David wiped his eyes. "What if we can't find common ground?" "You already have common ground," Bruce Lee said. You both love that restaurant. You both want it to succeed. You both want to honor your family. You're just speaking different languages about how to do it. Let me help you translate. 15 minutes later, the three men sat together in the Golden Dragon restaurant's dining room. The lights were dim, the street outside quiet, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bruce Lee sat between father and son, quite literally serving as a bridge. Mr. Wong. Bruce Lee began in Cantonese, then switched to English so David would understand every word. Tell David what you're really afraid of. Mr. Wong looked down at his hands, weathered from decades of work. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm afraid, when I die, nobody remember where we come from. Nobody remember my father, his father, all the sacrifice, all the history, just gone, like we never exist. David's face crumpled. Dad. Bruce Lee held up a hand gently, stopping him. David, tell your father what you're really afraid of. David took a shaky breath. I'm afraid that no matter what I do, I'll never be enough for you. That I'll always be too American for you, too Chinese for everyone else, that I don't belong anywhere. Mr. Wong looked at his son with tears streaming down his face. You think you're not enough. How could I be? David said, his voice breaking. I can't speak Cantonese like you. I don't know all the traditional recipes. I don't understand half the cultural references. I'm a failure as a Chinese son. No, Mr. Wong said forcefully, reaching across the table to grab David's hands. You not failure, you are success. You graduate university. You speak perfect English. You can do anything you want. That why I work so hard. Then why do you fight me every time I suggest changes? David asked desperately. Mr. Wong's hands trembled. Because I don't know how to help you with changes. I only know old way. I'm afraid if I say yes to changes, you think old way is worthless, that I am worthless. The truth hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Both father and son were crying now, years of misunderstanding finally breaking open. Bruce Lee let the moment breathe, then spoke softly. This is what I see. Mr. Wong, you built something beautiful, a place where Chinese culture could survive and thrive in a new land. You preserved traditions, taught your community, and created a legacy. Your roots go deep. He turned to David. And David, you have the ability to take that legacy and make it soar. To show a new generation what Chinese culture can be, not just what it was. You have the wings. Bruce Lee looked between them. But roots without wings wither and die, and wings without roots have nowhere to return to. You need each other. The restaurant needs both of you. Mr. Wong spoke hesitantly. But how? How we do both? Bruce Lee smiled. By doing what I did with martial arts. I studied every traditional form deeply. I honored the masters who came before me. Then I asked myself what serves the truth, and what is just habit. I kept what was essential, and evolved what needed to evolve. I created Jeet Kune Do, not by rejecting tradition, but by understanding it so deeply that I could build on it. He gestured around the restaurant. This place has incredible bones, Mr. Wong. The recipes, the atmosphere, the reputation. David, what if instead of selling, you and your father collaborated? Keep the heart of what makes this place special, but let it speak to today's world. David looked uncertain. Like what? Like this, Bruce Lee said, warming to the idea. You keep the traditional dishes that your grandfather taught your father. Those are sacred, the roots. But you add new dishes that blend Chinese techniques with ingredients and flavors that California offers. You honor the past and embrace the future. Mr. Wong was listening intently, fear and hope warring on his face. You keep the Chinese name, the cultural pride, Bruce Lee continued. But you make the menu accessible to people who don't speak Chinese. You train young Chinese American staff who can explain the culture to curious Americans. You become a bridge, just like both of you are. David's eyes were starting to light up. We could keep your traditional cooking class on Sundays, Dad. But maybe I could teach a fusion cooking class on Wednesdays. Mr. Wong looked uncertain but didn't say no. We could display photos of our family history, David continued, gaining enthusiasm. Tell the story of immigration, of building this place. Make it not just a restaurant but a story that people want to be part of. Yes, Bruce Lee said encouragingly. Americans are hungry for authentic stories, authentic connections. They're tired of fake experiences. Give them the real thing but help them understand it. Mr. Wong spoke quietly. You really want to work together. You not just want to make everything American. David reached across and took his father's hands again. Dad, I want to make it our ass. Yours and mine. I don't want to erase what you built. I want to help it grow. But I don't know how to do new things, Mr. Wong said, vulnerability clear in his voice. And I don't know how to do the old things as well as you, David replied. That's why we need each other. You teach me the roots. I help us grow the wings. Together. Bruce Lee stood up, sensing that his work here was largely done. Gentlemen, you have 72 hours before that contract needs an answer. I suggest you spend those 72 hours not arguing about whether to save the restaurant, but imagining what you could create together. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders. Mr. Wong, your legacy isn't just this building or these recipes. Your legacy is this man right here, your son, who loves you enough to feel torn apart by this conflict. Trust him with your roots. He'll grow them in ways you never imagined. Then he looked at David. And David, your father's strength isn't in staying the same, it's in surviving. He survived poverty, discrimination, a new country, a new language. He's stronger than you think. Trust him with your dreams. He's more capable of understanding than you believe. Bruce Lee stepped back. Be like water, gentlemen. Water takes the shape of whatever container it fills, but it never loses its essence. It adapts while staying true to what it is. Your restaurant can do the same. As Bruce Lee walked toward the door, Mr. Wong called out, Mr. Lee, why you help us? You don't even know us. Bruce Lee turned with a gentle smile. Because someone helped me once, when I was caught between two worlds. They taught me that being a bridge isn't a weakness, it's a gift. And now I see that gift in both of you. Don't waste it. He paused at the door. One more thing. In 3 days I'm hosting a cultural discussion at the community center. I'll be talking about the future of Chinese Americans in Hollywood and beyond. If you two come together, I'd love to hear what you've decided. And if you've found a way forward, I think your story could inspire many other families facing the same struggle. With that, Bruce Lee left the Golden Dragon restaurant. But the conversation he started continued long into the night. Father and son talked for hours, really listened to each other for perhaps the first time in years. They cried, they laughed, they remembered, and they dreamed. The contract lay forgotten on the counter, its deadline suddenly irrelevant. By dawn they had filled 3 notebooks with ideas, traditional recipes alongside fusion experiments, cultural history displays combined with modern design, cooking classes that taught technique and story, a restaurant that would honor every generation, past and future. 3 days later, Mr. Wong and David Wong walked into the community center together. Bruce Lee was speaking to a crowd of about 200 Chinese Americans, many of them wrestling with similar questions of identity and belonging. When Bruce Lee saw the Wongs enter together, he paused his talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce 2 people who embody what I've been discussing. Mr. Wong, David, would you be willing to share what you've discovered this week? Father and son looked at each other, then walked to the front together. Mr. Wong spoke first in careful English. 3 days ago, I want to give up. I think my son ashamed of me, of our culture. I think 40 years of work, all waste. His voice cracked. But I was wrong. My son not ashamed. He just trying to find his own way to honor our family. David put his arm around his father's shoulders, and I thought honoring my heritage meant staying frozen in the past. I thought I had to choose between being Chinese and being American. But my father and Mr. Lee taught me something profound. I don't have to choose. I get to be both. That's not a burden. That's a superpower. Mr. Wong continued. So we not sell restaurant. We, how you say, we evolve it, together. Father and son, old and new, root and wing. The audience was completely silent. Many with tears in their eyes. These were people who understood this struggle intimately. David spoke clearly to the crowd. How many of you have felt torn between honoring where you came from and reaching for where you want to go? Nearly every hand in the room went up. That's what Mr. Lee taught us, David continued. That tension we feel isn't a problem to solve, it's a strength to embrace. We're not stuck between two cultures, we are the bridge between them. And the world needs that bridge, Mr. Wong added, with pride in his voice. My father teach me, I teach my son. Now my son teach me. That is how family grow. Not forget. Not stuck. Grow. Bruce Lee stepped forward, his eyes shining. Mr. Wong just said something profound. That is how family grow. Not families grow, but family grow. Because when roots and wings work together, when tradition and innovation dance together, the entire family, the entire community grows stronger. He addressed the audience. How many of you are business owners facing decisions about whether to modernize or maintain tradition? About 30 hands went up. How many of you are the children of immigrants, trying to honor your parents, while building your own identity? Nearly all the remaining hands raised. Then the Wong family's story is your story, Bruce Lee said. And their solution could be your solution. Don't see your dual identity as a curse. See it as what it truly is. A gift. You have twice the perspective, twice the wisdom, twice the opportunity. Over the next hour, the community center transformed into a workshop. Families who had been fighting about similar issues started talking. Business owners started collaborating on how to honor tradition while embracing change. Young people started seeing their parents' sacrifices in a new light. Parents started understanding their children's struggles more deeply. The Wong family's story had opened a floodgate. One by one, people stood and shared their own struggles with identity, belonging, and the tension between roots and wings. And one by one, with Bruce Lee's guidance and the Wong's example, they started finding their own bridges. By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. What started as Bruce Lee's lecture had become a movement. The concept of roots and wings became a rallying cry for Chinese Americans trying to navigate their dual identity. Mr. Wong and David stood together, watching the transformation they had helped spark, and both were crying again. But this time with joy. Their pain had become purpose. Their struggle had become strength. Bruce Lee approached them as the crowd was dispersing. Gentlemen, what you did today, you gave 200 people permission to stop fighting themselves. That's no small thing. Mr. Wong bowed deeply. Mr. Lee, you saved my family. How I can thank you. Bruce Lee shook his head. You saved yourselves. I just helped you find the words you were already feeling. And now you've helped others find their words too. David extended his hand to Bruce Lee. You said someone helped you when you were caught between worlds. Who was it? Bruce Lee smiled with deep affection. My wife Linda. She saw me struggling to be Chinese enough for Chinese people and American enough for American people. She told me, stop trying to be what others expect. Just be Bruce Lee. That simple permission changed everything. He looked at both Wongs. That's what you gave each other tonight. Permission to be yourselves. Not your father's version of you, David. And not your son's version of you, Mr. Wong. But your true selves, which include both tradition and innovation. Both roots and wings. 6 months later, the Golden Dragon restaurant reopened after a beautiful renovation. The exterior kept its traditional Chinese architectural elements, but with a fresh, inviting modern touch. Inside, one wall displayed the family's immigration story with photos spanning 3 generations. Another wall explained the philosophy of traditional Chinese cooking. The menu was brilliant. traditional dishes that Mr. Wong's father had taught him, each with a story explaining its cultural significance. And next to them, fusion dishes created by David, each showing how Chinese techniques could dance with California ingredients. But the real magic was in the kitchen. Father and son worked side by side, Mr. Wong teaching traditional techniques while David experimented with new combinations. And when customers could see into the kitchen through a new open design, they saw something beautiful, a living example of how tradition and innovation could create something stronger together than either could alone. The restaurant became wildly successful, but not just commercially. It became a gathering place for Chinese American families working through their own generational conflicts. Mr. Wong and David offered family workshops where parents and children could cook together, share stories, and find their own bridges. Bruce Lee visited often, always greeted like family. He would sit in his corner booth, sip tea, and smile watching the miracle he had helped create. Not just a saved restaurant, but a healed family. Not just a business success, but a community transformation. One evening, as Bruce Lee was leaving after a meal, a young Chinese-American college student approached him nervously. "Mr. Lee, I heard about what you did for the Wong family. My parents and I are fighting about the same things. They want me to be more traditional. I want more freedom. I feel torn apart." Bruce Lee smiled gently and gestured toward the restaurant behind them. "See that place? 6 months ago it was about to disappear forever. Not because the food was bad or the location was wrong, but because a father and son forgot how to see each other clearly." He placed a hand on the young person's shoulder. "Here's what I've learned. Your parents' traditions aren't chains. They're wings made by your ancestors, tested by time, offered to you as gifts. And your desire for innovation isn't rebellion. It's the roots of your generation, the wisdom you're developing to offer the future." The student looked confused. "But you said wings and roots the opposite way." "Exactly," Bruce Lee said with a knowing smile. "Because it doesn't matter which generation has which. What matters is understanding that both are necessary. Your parents give you roots through their traditions. You give them wings through your innovation. Together you're complete." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Don't fight your parents, and don't surrender yourself. Collaborate. The tension you feel isn't tearing you apart. It's the creative friction that will forge something extraordinary." As Bruce Lee disappeared into the Chinatown evening, the students stood there, tears streaming down their face, feeling for the first time that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to choose. Maybe they could be both. And that's exactly what Bruce Lee had been teaching all along. Not just to the Wongs, not just to that student, but to everyone willing to listen. The lesson that being caught between two worlds isn't a course, it's an opportunity. The story of Bruce Lee and the Wong family spread throughout the Chinese American community. It became a touchstone, a reference point, proof that the struggle so many felt wasn't unique and wasn't insurmountable. Over the next 2 years, 17 other family businesses in Chinatown went through similar transformations. Generational conflicts became generational collaborations. Parents learned to trust their children's innovations. Children learned to value their parents' wisdom. And the entire community became stronger. Mr. Wong passed away in 1985, 14 years after that pivotal conversation. But he died knowing his legacy was secure, not because the restaurant remained unchanged, but because it had evolved. His grandson, David's son, worked in the kitchen alongside his father, learning both traditional techniques and modern innovations. At Mr. Wong's funeral, David gave a eulogy that moved everyone present. "My father taught me how to honor the past. Bruce Lee taught us how to embrace the future. But together they taught me the most important lesson, that roots and wings aren't opposites. They're partners." He looked at his own son. "And now I get to teach the next generation. Not to be stuck in the past or to forget where they came from, but to be bridges, just like my father, just like Bruce Lee, just like all of us who carry two worlds in our hearts." The Golden Dragon restaurant still stands today, now run by David's son with the same philosophy. The walls still tell the immigration story. The menu still honors both tradition and innovation. And somewhere in the dining room, at that corner booth where Bruce Lee used to sit, there's a small plaque. It reads, "In memory of Bruce Lee, who taught us that being caught between two worlds means you have twice the strength, twice the wisdom, and twice the ability to build bridges. Be like water, honor your roots, spread your wings." If this story of family healing, cultural bridge building, and the wisdom of a martial arts master moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who's struggling between honoring tradition and embracing change. Have you ever felt torn between two worlds? How did you find your bridge? Let us know in the comments. And remember Bruce Lee's wisdom: you're not stuck between two cultures, two generations, or two ways of being. You are the bridge the world needs. Don't fight that gift. Embrace it, because the strongest families, the strongest communities, and the strongest individuals are the ones who understand that roots and wings work best together. For in the balance of roots and wings, we do not just survive history, we shape it.